Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to respond to a suggestion that was made a moment ago by one of my colleagues to the effect that there's harm on both sides, to the effect that, if I understood the comment correctly, sometimes the discrimination against ideas on social media networks cut one way politically and sometimes they cut the other way politically. That may be true as far as those words go in and of themselves, but it's a blatant mischaracterization of anyone's perception of the way these social media networks operate. As I understand our two witnesses today, they're not disputing the fact that there is a problem. Now, it may be just a problem of corporate culture within their respective companies, but there is a problem. There is rather blatant bias in one direction politically. I mean, we saw it just a few minutes ago in my interaction with Mr. Potts. You know, an image of a baby when used by the Susan B. Anthony advertisement gets taken down. And it doesn't get taken down when a comparable image of a baby in a hospital, even a baby that's premature and undergoing medical treatment, doesn't get taken down. It's not lost on any of us that this cuts overwhelmingly one direction and not the other. That doesn't mean we can't identify aberrational examples, examples of where it cuts the other direction. But I don't hear either one of you disputing or making any attempt to refute the idea that we do have a political bias issue here. It doesn't mean necessarily that it's the government's issue to resolve. It doesn't mean that we own your companies and can tell you what to do. But insofar as you would have your users suggest and believe that you are somehow a politically neutral forum, that's laughable. No one assumes that to be true, and I don't hear you saying that. Mr. Monhay, I'd like to start with you. I heard you mention something a few minutes ago in reference to questions from the chairman about this statement by Jack Dorsey. The statement was, I don't believe that we can afford to take a neutral stance anymore. I don't believe we should optimize for neutrality. You gave context for that quote, and I don't have the written version of that in front of me. Can you give me the context for that again?
I appreciate it very much, sir. What he was distinguishing was the two words, neutrality versus impartiality, and that we were aiming for impartiality, which is more action-focused as opposed to a more passive in neutrality.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the distinction for purposes of our discussion today. Can you help me understand why that makes any difference for the problem we're identifying?
That we work extremely hard, and the people that come to Twitter every day work extremely hard to make sure that people on all sides of every debate, and 3/4 of our users overseas, have the opportunity to talk about what it is they care about and not have the platform be the subject of the discussion. That takes a lot of effort. Creating a safe environment where people aren't facing threats of violence or threats of rape, child sexual exploitation. It takes active effort, and that's what Jack was talking about.
And I understand that. I appreciate that. I don't hear you refuting the notion that there is some bias within the company politically. By the way, how would you characterize your corporate culture as it relates to the political world? Would you characterize it as particularly conservative?
I would politely disagree with the premise of your question and say that I disagree with what you're saying, is that we work every day to make sure that our platform is impartial and that everybody can come to it to speak. And people don't come to Twitter to work because of, they're on one side of one issue or the other.
Yeah, I haven't suggested that, and I resent your suggestion that I've suggested that. Are you suggesting to me, sir, that your workforce and the people who monitor the content of what's posted on Twitter are equally Republican and Democratic? Surely you're not suggesting that.
I'm sorry if I offended you. I don't understand how I did. I'm telling you that we have a global audience. We have a global workforce, and they come to Twitter to build a platform where people could find out what's happening in the world and talk about what's happening in the world. And it is in our interest as a company, it is in our interest as our advertiser to have eyeballs that care about all these issues.
Yeah, not my question. My question, with respect, sir, is about your workforce. Do you think your workforce has the ability to engage in self-reflection, in meaningful self-criticism, with regard to whether or not it's filtering content in a politically neutral manner?
I think that is an excellent question. I think Senator Sass mentioned something earlier that I go back to, which is if we were running a sandwich shop, it's likening it to have a board, a comment board at the front that allowed anybody to say, the ham sandwiches here are terrible. The tuna sandwiches are terrible. And that's what Twitter allows, is a platform that not only allows people on all sides of the debate, but also to criticize us. We found out about Senator Hawley's letter to us because he tweeted it. That's the kind of open environment that we're trying to build and that every employee comes to Twitter to do.
What about the kind of environment that allows someone to say abortion is terrible or abortion is a fundamental right? Is that equally important?
Those conversations happen on Twitter every day.
They do. And are you suggesting that they are treated in an ambidextrous fashion?
We strive to do that every day, yes.
You strive to do that. What about you, Mr. Potts? How would you describe your corporate culture within Facebook?
Thank you, Senator. There was one thing that you said that I agree that we have political bias. I want to be very clear. I've said a few times in this hearing that I don't think we have political bias. I do not think we have political bias. I do not think we have a strong issue against marginalized communities either. What I did say is that there is the room for unconscious bias that we do not recognize, and that is why we're doing those assessments. But again, I want to just be, for extreme clarity, that I do not believe that we have this issue. And so I don't think that that bias exists at Facebook. Now to the question of corporate culture, I think within our Bay Area-based office, it probably does, we would probably have more liberal or people who identify as Democrats than we do as Republicans. We are a global company. We have a large presence in Texas. We have a large presence here in DC, as well as New York. We have a large presence in Dublin. We have a large presence in Singapore. So we are a global company. And I am not the correct person to ask what everyone's political ideology is, because we don't do a survey on that either.
And I don't mean to suggest that you should, and I would find that thought horrifying that we as a Congress would ever suggest that you should. But since we're having a conversation about whether or not you're able to operate a forum that is at least perceived as having a certain degree of objectivity and neutrality, and since we've established, I think, that in many circumstances you end up with disparate treatment of very, very similar images. And look, this is unmistakable, and it's insofar as you're suggesting that this doesn't produce very different outcomes on the right from the outcomes that are achieved on the left. That is laughable. And so I'm asking you, are we crazy in perceiving this? Or are we wrong? Or could there possibly be something about your procedures that are not capable of monitoring and maintaining a politically neutral forum for discussion?
Senator, again, we are a platform for diversity of viewpoints. Your question about the disparate impact of our policies as they apply to any group, whether that be conservative, whether that be a marginalized group, and how those policies are actually enforced, and that it produces an outcome that is unintended, something that we take very seriously. We do some research. We're trying to do more research, but that's also why we have hired and engaged Senator Kyle, Laura Murphy, to collect these anecdotes, to hear.
Well, that's great, but I heard you say a few minutes ago you're going to have Senator Kyle go and talk to conservative groups. That's great. I really don't know what that's supposed to do. Having Senator Kyle interact with other conservatives, I don't know what that does for Facebook. I don't know what that should do for anyone who's concerned about whether or not this is able to operate as a platform that presents itself to the world with a degree of neutrality.
I am not a constitutional scholar, so I can't speak.
This doesn't require.
Right.
This is not even about the Constitution. I'm just asking about the political neutrality of Facebook as it's perceived by the world. There is no constitutional issue here.
That is fair, Senator. I was going to really try to go back to the disparate impact of rules. And I think part of that in the study, you need to hear those anecdotes to collect the information, the data, to actually see, to find which policies that may be ripe for review, to see if those are actually violating. So I don't know how you can't really review the policy without hearing where you think it's being misapplied, if that makes sense. That's the way I interpret it. Now, I'm not the one carrying out the review, so I don't know how their methodology ESG is going. But if I was to run the review, I would need to collect the data of where we thought the policy was misapplied, where it is having that impact. Then I would look to the policy to say, okay, how did you write this? What is the intended? And then how is it being enforced? That's how I would go about it. Now, Senator Kyle, Laura Murphy, they have their own processes. They have their own ways of going about it. So I can't speak to them. But that's kind of the first point where I would start to. So I would go out and collect those anecdotes, collect where I think, okay, is it the case that we over-enforce on pro-choice content, or is it the case that we over-enforce on pro-life content? Bring that back and see what policies apply, and then work through the process, say, you know what, you actually do over-enforce in this area. Why is that? And then you can find, I think you'll find answers.
Yeah. Look, there are no easy solutions here, and I don't mean to suggest by any of this that I envy your position or that I think this is an easy thing. But I will suggest that if I were to run a global social media network, we'll call it Cruise Book, from my hometown of Alpine, Utah, and I were to staff it entirely with people from Alpine, Utah, who share my political worldview more than people outside of my hometown of Alpine, Utah, it would probably produce a different discussion than what you have with a company that's overwhelmingly run by people with a very different political worldview and political philosophy than I do. And I would he didn't ask for it, but I would respectfully suggest that that's one of the things you ought to be looking to. It's great that you've got Senator Kyle talking to conservative groups. I think that's fantastic. I don't think that's going to change anything as long as your corporate culture remains as it is, overwhelmingly to one side. That is entirely your prerogative as a company if you want to do that, but I don't know that that's necessarily where you want to be or how you're portraying yourself to the world. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.